I never thought a single sentence could unravel everything I'd built over 20 years. My son, Ethan, stood in the living room, his broad shoulders hunched, his voice sharp as a blade. "I wish Grandma Claire had raised me," he said, his words slicing through the air, through me, through the fragile threads that held our family together. His eyes, those same hazel eyes I'd stared into when he was a newborn, burned with something I didn't recognize: resentment, maybe, or something darker. I stood frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, the world tilting beneath me. How had we gotten here? How had my boy, my only child, turned into this stranger who wished for another mother, another life? It wasn't always like this. I'd raised Ethan alone after his father, Mark, walked out when Ethan was barely 2. Mark's departure was a quiet betrayal, a note left on the counter and a suitcase gone by morning. I didn't cry then. I couldn't afford to. Ethan needed me, and I poured everything into him: every late night at the diner, every scraped-together dollar for his soccer cleats, every bedtime story I read until my voice cracked. I thought I'd done enough. I thought love was enough. But standing there, hearing Ethan wish for his mother-in-law, Claire, Mark's mother, of all people, I realized I'd been fighting a ghost all along. Claire had always been a shadow in our lives. She'd send Ethan birthday cards with crisp $20 bills tucked inside, call him on holidays with her syrupy voice, and invite him to her pristine house in the suburbs every summer. I let him go because I wanted him to have family, to feel connected to something bigger than our little apartment with its leaky faucet and peeling paint. But every time he came back, he was quieter, his eyes distant, like he was comparing me to her. Claire, with her manicured lawn and her homemade pies, her endless stories about Mark's childhood that painted him as some misunderstood hero. I hated her for it, but I swallowed it down, told myself it didn't matter. Until now. "Why would you say that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, afraid of the answer. Ethan's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Because she listens," he said. "She doesn't scream at me when I mess up. She doesn't make me feel like I'm never good enough." His words hit like punches, each one landing harder than the last. I wanted to scream that I'd given him everything, that I'd sacrificed my youth, my dreams, my heart to keep him safe. But the words caught in my throat, tangled with the fear that he was right. I don't know when it started, this rift between us. Maybe it was when he turned 16 and started asking about his father. I'd always been honest: Mark was a coward who chose himself over us. But Ethan didn't want to hear it. He'd dig through old photos, ask questions I couldn't answer, and I'd see the hunger in his eyes for something I couldn't give him. Claire fed that hunger. She filled his head with stories, with promises that Mark would come back one day, that he'd make things right. And Ethan believed her. He believed her over me. That night, after Ethan stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook, I sat on the couch, staring at the family photo on the coffee table. It was from Ethan's 10th birthday, just the two of us, smiling under a homemade banner that read, "Happy Birthday, Champ." I'd been so proud of that day, of the cake I'd baked from scratch, of the way Ethan's eyes lit up when he opened his new soccer ball. Now, that memory felt like a lie. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The house was too quiet, the silence screaming with his words. I wish Grandma Claire had raised me. By morning, I was a wreck, my eyes swollen, my heart a bruise. I expected Ethan to stay gone, to crash at his friend's house like he usually did when we fought. But at 7 a.m., the door creaked open, and there he was, his face pale, his eyes red-rimmed. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking. I didn't mean it. I wanted to believe him, to pull him into my arms like I did when he was little, but something held me back. Regret was written all over his face, but so was something else: guilt, maybe, or fear. "What happened?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. He sank onto the couch, his hands shaking as he ran them through his hair. "I went to Grandma Claire's last night," he said. "I was so mad I needed to get away." My stomach twisted, but I stayed silent, letting him continue. "She told me things, Mom. Things about Dad. About you." His voice cracked, and he looked at me, his eyes pleading for something I didn't understand. "She said you kept him away, that you never gave him a chance to be a father. She said you were selfish." Selfish. The word burned, a fresh wound on top of the one he'd inflicted last night. Claire had always been good at twisting the truth, at painting herself as the saint and me as the villain. I wanted to scream, to tell Ethan how she'd enabled Mark's abandonment, how she'd sent him money while I worked double shifts to keep us afloat. But I didn't, because Ethan wasn't done. I believed her, he said, his voice barely audible. For a minute, I believed her. But then she showed me his letters. Letters. My heart stopped. I hadn't known about any letters. What letters? I asked, my voice sharp now, cutting through the haze of hurt. Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor. Letters Dad wrote to her. From years ago. He wrote about you. About how he left because he couldn't handle it, couldn't handle you. He said you were too much, too angry, too broken. Each word was a dagger, and I felt myself bleeding out, right there in our living room. But Ethan wasn't looking at me with anger anymore. He was crying, tears streaming down his face as he reached for my hand. I read them, Mom, and I realized something. He was wrong. He didn't know you. He didn't know how hard you fought for me. And Grandma Claire, she kept those letters all this time, feeding me lies, making me think you were the problem. His voice broke, and he squeezed my hand, his grip desperate. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I wanted to forgive him, to erase the pain of last night, but the wound was too fresh, too deep. Claire's lies had poisoned him, had turned my son against me, and the anger I felt wasn't just at her, it was at myself, for letting her into our lives, for not fighting harder to keep her out. But as I looked at Ethan, his face crumpled with regret, I knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something bigger, something uglier. Claire had played her hand, but I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. I sat there, Ethan's hand still clutching mine, his tears falling onto the couch between us. The air felt heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to speak. But what could I say? My son had just confessed to believing I was the villain in his father's story, that I'd driven Mark away with my flaws. The truth was, I'd spent years blaming myself too, wondering if I'd been too hard, too unforgiving, too broken to keep him. But hearing it from Ethan, filtered through Claire's venom, was a different kind of pain. It was betrayal, raw and jagged, cutting deeper than Mark's abandonment ever had. I pulled my hand away, not because I didn't love him, but because I needed space to breathe, to think. Ethan's eyes widened, panic flickering across his face. Mom, please, he said, his voice trembling. I know I messed up. I shouldn't have gone to her. I shouldn't have listened. But I wasn't ready to absolve him, not yet. The hurt was too fresh, and Claire's shadow loomed too large. What else did she tell you? I asked, my voice low, steady, though inside I was screaming. Ethan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor, and I knew there was more, something he was afraid to say. She said. He swallowed hard, his hands twisting together. She said Dad wanted to come back, years ago, that he tried, but you wouldn't let him. She said you burned his letters, that you wanted to keep me all to yourself. My breath caught, a sharp pain slicing through my chest. Burned his letters? I'd never seen a single one. Mark had vanished without a trace, leaving nothing but a note that said, I can't do this anymore. I'd spent nights staring at that note, memorizing its cold, careless words, wondering what I'd done wrong. And now Claire was rewriting history, making me the monster. That's a lie, I said, my voice shaking with fury. Your father never wrote to me. He never called, never showed up, nothing. If there were letters, Claire kept them from me. Ethan's eyes searched mine, desperate for the truth, but I could see the doubt lingering, a seed Claire had planted too deep. Why would she do that? He asked, his voice small, like he was a child again, begging for answers I didn't have. I wanted to shake him, to make him see her for what she was, a manipulator, a liar who'd used her own son's absence to twist mine against me. But I didn't. Instead, I stood, my legs unsteady, and walked to the window, staring out at the gray morning sky. I don't know why, I said finally, my back to him. But I'm going to find out. The words felt like a vow, a promise to myself and to Ethan. Claire had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let her poison my son any longer. I turned to face him, my resolve hardening. Where are the letters now? Ethan's face paled, and he shifted uncomfortably. She wouldn't let me take them, he said. She said they were private, that she was only showing me to help me understand. Understand. The word twisted in my gut, a bitter reminder of how easily she'd manipulated him. I didn't know what those letters contained, but I knew they were the key to unraveling Claire's lies. I'd spent too long letting her play the doting grandmother, the saintly figure who swooped in with cookies and smiles while I scraped by, the single mother who could never compete with her polished perfection. But this wasn't about cookies or summer visits anymore. This was about my son, my family, my truth. I'm going to her house, I said, grabbing my keys from the counter. Ethan's eyes widened, and he stood, reaching for my arm. Mom, wait. You can't just, I can't. I cut him off, my voice sharp. And I will. She doesn't get to rewrite our lives, Ethan. Not without a fight. He looked at me, his expression torn between fear and guilt, and I knew he was seeing me differently maybe for the first time. Not just as his mother, but as a woman who'd been hurt, who'd fought, who'd survived. I'm coming with you, he said, his voice firm now, no trace of the boy who'd run to Claire last night. I nodded, my throat tight, and we left together, the silence between us heavy but not empty. It was the silence of two people bracing for a storm. Claire's house was a 30-minute drive, a world away from our cramped apartment. Her neighborhood was all manicured lawns and white picket fences, the kind of place that screamed money and secrets. As we pulled into her driveway, my stomach churned. The last time I'd been here was years ago, dropping Ethan off for one of his summer visits. She'd greeted me with a tight smile, her eyes cold, like I was an intruder in her perfect world. Now, I was here to confront her, to demand answers, and I wasn't leaving without them. Ethan knocked on the door, his knuckles hesitant, and I stood behind him, my heart pounding. When Claire opened the door, her face lit up at the sight of Ethan, but it faltered when she saw me. Laura, she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. What a surprise. She was dressed impeccably, her silver hair pulled back, her cardigan pristine, like she'd stepped out of a catalog. But I saw the flicker of unease in her eyes, and it fueled me. We need to talk, I said, stepping past her without waiting for an invitation. Ethan followed, his shoulders tense, and Claire closed the door behind us, her smile fading. The living room was just as I remembered: polished wood, floral curtains, a shrine to a life I'd never been part of. On the coffee table sat a stack of envelopes, yellowed with age, tied with a red ribbon. My heart stopped. The letters. Claire followed my gaze, and her lips tightened. Those are private, she said quickly, moving to scoop them up, but I was faster. I grabbed the stack, my hands shaking as I untied the ribbon. If they're about me, they're not private, I said, my voice low, dangerous. Ethan stood frozen, his eyes darting between us, and I could feel the weight of his uncertainty, his fear that he'd started something he couldn't stop. Laura, you don't understand, Claire said, her voice rising, a crack in her perfect facade. Those letters are from my son. They're all I have left of him. Her words were meant to guilt me, to make me back down, but they only fueled my anger. Your son, I spat, who left us, who left me to raise Ethan alone. And you've been lying to him, telling him I kept Mark away, that I burned his letters. I never saw a single one, Claire. Not one. Her face paled, and for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. Real fear. Ethan stepped forward, his voice shaking but resolute. Grandma, why did you tell me Mom burned them? Why did you make me think she was the reason Dad stayed away? Claire's eyes darted to him, and for a moment, I thought she'd lie again, spin another story to save herself. But then she sank onto the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and I knew we were about to hear the truth, or at least part of it. I was protecting you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Both of you. But her words rang hollow, and as I clutched the letters, I knew the real story was in my hands, waiting to be uncovered. I stood there, the stack of letters trembling in my hands, their worn edges biting into my palms. The room felt too small, the air too thick, as if Claire's pristine living room was closing in on us. Ethan's eyes were locked on me, wide and searching, while Claire sat on the couch, her hands twisted together, her composure cracking like thin ice. I wanted to tear open every envelope, to read every word Mark had written, to finally understand why he'd left and why Claire had spent years poisoning my son against me. But something in her expression, part defiance, part desperation, made me pause. This wasn't just about the letters. This was about power, about control, about a woman who'd built a fantasy around her son and would do anything to keep it alive. Protecting us? I said, my voice sharp enough to cut through her flimsy excuse. You call lying to Ethan protecting him? Telling him I kept his father away, that I burned his letters? You've been manipulating him for years, Claire. Her lips parted, but no words came out, and I pressed on, my anger spilling over. You wanted him to hate me, didn't you? To think you were the perfect mother he never had. Ethan flinched beside me, and I hated how my words hurt him, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the truth was so close. Claire's eyes hardened, and she stood, her posture rigid, her voice low but steady. You don't know what it's like, Laura, to lose a child. Mark was my son, my only son, and when he left, I lost him too. Those letters. She gestured to the stack in my hands, her voice breaking. They were all I had. I couldn't let you take that from me too. Her words hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I saw her not as the enemy, but as a mother grieving, clinging to a ghost. But that moment passed, and the anger roared back. You didn't lose Ethan, I said. I did everything to keep him safe, to give him a life, while you fed him lies about a father who didn't care enough to stay. Ethan's voice broke through, quiet but firm. Grandma, just tell us the truth. What's in the letters? Why did you hide them? His eyes were pleading, and I saw the boy I'd raised, the one who trusted me to make things right. Claire looked at him, her face softening. But there was something else there too, guilt, maybe, or fear. I didn't hide them, she said, but her voice wavered. I kept them safe. For when you were ready. It was a lie, and we all knew it. The air crackled with tension, and I couldn't wait any longer. I tore open the first envelope, my hands shaking as I pulled out a single sheet of paper, yellowed and creased. Mark's handwriting was messy, the ink faded, but the words were clear enough to burn. Mom, it began, I can't do this anymore. Laura's too much, always angry, always pushing. I tried, but I'm not cut out for this family thing. Tell Ethan I'm sorry, but it's better this way. My breath caught, and I felt Ethan lean closer, reading over my shoulder. His body tensed, and I knew he was feeling the same betrayal I was. Mark hadn't just left May, he'd left Ethan, and he'd done it willingly, without a fight. I flipped through the stack, scanning more letters, each one worse than the last. She's too broken, he wrote in one. She'll ruin him if I stay. In another, I need to start over. Don't tell her where I am. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from rage. All these years, I'd carried the weight of his abandonment, wondering if I'd driven him away. And here was the proof, Mark's own words, confessing his cowardice, his selfishness. But Claire had kept them, not to protect Ethan, but to protect Mark's memory, to keep him a hero in her grandson's eyes. I looked at her, my voice deadly calm. You read these. You knew what he said about me, about Ethan, and you still let him think I was the problem. Claire's face crumpled, and she sank back onto the couch, her hands covering her face. I didn't want him to hate his father, she whispered. I thought I could make it right. Ethan's voice was hoarse, barely audible. You made me hate my mom instead. The words hung in the air, heavy and final, and I saw something break in Claire. She reached for him, but he stepped back, closer to me, and I felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real. Ethan, please, she said, her voice trembling. I love you. I only wanted to give you a family. But Ethan shook his head, his eyes wet but resolute. You had no right, he said. You had no right to lie to me. I wanted to scream at her, to tear apart her perfect house, her perfect lies, but Ethan's hand on my arm stopped me. Mom, he said, his voice steady now, let's go. I looked at him, at the man he was becoming, and I nodded. But before we left, I turned back to Claire, the letters still in my hand. You don't get to control this anymore, I said. He's my son, and we're done with your lies. I didn't wait for her response. I walked out, Ethan beside me, the letters a heavy weight in my pocket, but also a weapon. A weapon I wasn't sure how to use yet, but one I knew I'd need. The drive home was silent, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was the silence of two people who'd seen the truth, raw and ugly, and were trying to figure out what came next. When we got back to the apartment, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. I'm so sorry, Mom, he said again, his voice breaking. I didn't know. I didn't know what she was doing. I sat across from him, the letters spread out between us like a map of our pain. I know, I said, and for the first time in hours, I felt the anger ebb, replaced by something softer, something like forgiveness. But forgiveness wasn't enough. Not yet. Claire's lies had done more than hurt us. They'd fractured something fundamental, something I wasn't sure we could rebuild. And Mark, wherever he was still out there, a ghost who'd left us to clean up his mess. I looked at Ethan, at the guilt and regret etched into his face, and I knew this wasn't over. Claire had started this war, but I wasn't going to let her win. Not without a fight. And as I reached for the next letter, I felt a fire kindling inside me, a determination to reclaim my son, my truth, my family, no matter what it took. The kitchen table was a battlefield, the letters scattered across it like shrapnel. Ethan sat across from me, his eyes fixed on the yellowed envelopes, his hands clenched into fists. I could feel the weight of his guilt, his confusion, pressing down on him, but I was too raw to comfort him yet. My fingers traced the edges of the next letter, my heart pounding as I pulled it open. Mark's words stared back at me, each one a fresh wound. "Mom, I'm in Seattle now," he wrote. "Got a job at a bar. Don't tell Laura. She'll just make it harder." I read it aloud, my voice steady despite the storm inside me, and Ethan's face tightened, his jaw set like he was bracing for a blow. Seattle. He'd been in Seattle, living a new life while I worked double shifts, while I bandaged Ethan's scraped knees and stayed up late helping him with homework. I'd imagined Mark 1,000 different ways over the years, dead, lost, suffering somewhere, but never this. Never just gone, choosing a bar over his son. I flipped through more letters, each one painting a clearer picture of a man who'd run from responsibility, who'd built a new life on the ashes of ours. "He never asked about me," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not once." I looked at him, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, and I wanted to reach across the table, to hold him like I used to, but the letters held me captive. I kept reading, unable to stop, each word fueling the fire in my chest. In one, Mark wrote about a woman he'd met, someone named Sarah who understood him. In another, he talked about his plans to open his own bar, as if his life with us had never existed. But it was the last letter that broke me. "Mom, I know Ethan's better off without me," he wrote. "Laura's strong. She'll make sure he's okay. Just keep an eye on him for me." I dropped the letter, my hands shaking, my vision blurring. Strong. He'd called me strong, like it was a compliment, like it excused everything he'd done. I wasn't strong. I was surviving, piecing together a life for Ethan out of sheer desperation, and Claire had known. She'd known and kept it from us. Ethan reached for the letter, his fingers brushing mine, and I saw the moment it hit him, the moment he realized his father hadn't just chosen to stay gone. "He didn't want me," he said, his voice hollow, and I couldn't hold back anymore. I stood, rounded the table, and pulled him into my arms, his head against my shoulder like he was 5 years old again. "He didn't deserve you," I whispered, my voice fierce. "He never did." Ethan's shoulders shook, and I held him tighter, the letters forgotten for a moment as I tried to shield him from the pain I'd spent years carrying alone. But the pain wasn't just Mark's anymore. It was Claire's too. She'd had these letters all along, known the truth about her son, and instead of telling Ethan, instead of protecting him, she'd used them to drive a wedge between us. I pulled back, looking into Ethan's eyes, and I saw something new there: resolve, maybe, or anger. "What do we do now?" he asked, and I knew he wasn't just talking about the letters. He was talking about Claire, about the lies, about the family we'd thought we had. "We confront her again," I said, my voice steady now, fueled by a clarity I hadn't felt in years. "But this time, we do it on our terms." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight, and I knew he was with me, fully with me, for the first time in too long. We spent the rest of the day reading through the letters, piecing together Mark's life, his excuses, his absence. Each one was a brick in the wall of truth we were building, a wall that would protect us from Claire's manipulations. By nightfall, we had a plan, not a perfect one, but a start. We'd go back to Claire's, not to beg or plead, but to demand answers, to make her face the consequences of her lies. The next morning, we drove back to her house, the letters tucked into a folder in my bag. The air was crisp, the sky heavy with clouds, and I felt like a soldier heading into battle. Ethan was quiet, his hands gripping the steering wheel, but I could sense his determination, his need to make this right. When we pulled into Claire's driveway, my stomach twisted, but I pushed it down. This wasn't about fear anymore. This was about justice. Claire opened the door, her face pale, her eyes wary. "You're back," she said, her voice flat, like she'd been expecting us. "We're not here to talk," I said, stepping inside, Ethan at my side. "We're here for the truth." I pulled the folder from my bag, slamming it onto her coffee table, the letters spilling out like evidence in a trial. "You knew what Mark did," I said, my voice rising. "You knew he chose to leave, that he didn't want us. And you lied to Ethan, made him think I was the one who kept his father away." Claire's eyes darted to the letters, then to Ethan, and I saw the moment her defenses crumbled. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "I just wanted you to have a father, Ethan. I thought if you believed he wanted to come back, it would be easier." Ethan's face hardened, and he stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "You made it worse," he said. "You made me doubt my mom, the one person who's always been there. You don't get to decide what's easier for me." I watched Claire's face, waiting for her to fight back, to spin another lie, but she didn't. She just sat there, her hands clasped, her eyes wet. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and for the first time, I believed her. Not because I trusted her, but because she'd run out of lies to tell. The letters had stripped her bare, exposed her for what she was, a mother who'd clung to a fantasy at the cost of her grandson's trust. I wanted to hate her, to scream at her, but as I looked at Ethan, I realized something. This wasn't just about Claire. It was about us, about rebuilding what she'd tried to tear apart. Let's go, I said to Ethan, my voice soft but firm. He nodded, and we turned to leave, the letters still scattered on the table. Claire didn't try to stop us, didn't say another word, and as we walked out, I felt a weight lift, not completely, but enough to breathe. The drive home was quiet again, but this time, it was a different kind of silence, the kind that comes after a storm, when the air is clear and the world feels new. We weren't healed, not yet, but we were together, and that was enough for now. Back at the apartment, the silence between Ethan and me was different, less heavy, more like a pause before something new. We sat at the kitchen table, the letters still spread out, their words lingering like ghosts. I looked at Ethan, his face drawn, his eyes older than they should have been for 19. He'd read every letter, absorbed every betrayal, and I could see the weight of it settling into him, changing him. I wanted to protect him from it, to take it all back, but I couldn't. All I could do was be here, with him, as we figured out what came next. Mom, he said, breaking the silence, his voice rough. I don't know how to fix this. He gestured to the letters, to the space between us, to everything we'd lost. I reached across the table, my hand covering his, and for the first time in days, he didn't pull away. We don't have to fix it all at once, I said. We just have to start. He nodded, his eyes meeting mine, and I saw a flicker of the boy who used to run to me when he was scared, who trusted me to make everything okay. That boy wasn't gone, not completely, and I clung to that. But starting wasn't simple. Claire's lies had left scars, and Mark's letters had reopened wounds I'd thought were healed. I couldn't stop thinking about her, sitting in her perfect house, surrounded by her perfect lies, believing she'd done the right thing. Part of me wanted to go back, to scream at her until she understood the damage she'd caused. But another part, the part that had fought for Ethan all these years, knew that wasn't the answer. Revenge wouldn't heal us. It wouldn't give Ethan back the father he'd never had, or erase the years I'd spent doubting myself. What we needed was something harder, something braver, redemption, not for Claire, but for us. I want to find him, Ethan said suddenly, his voice steady, resolute. I froze, my hand still on his, my heart stuttering. Find who? I asked, though I already knew. Dad, he said, his eyes locked on mine, daring me to argue. I need to know why. Why he left. Why he never came back. I need to hear it from him. My first instinct was to say no, to protect him from more pain, from the man who'd walked away without a backward glance. But I saw the determination in his eyes, the need for closure, and I knew I couldn't deny him that. Not after everything. Okay, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But we do it together. Ethan's shoulders relaxed, and he nodded, a small, grateful smile breaking through the tension. We spent the rest of the day making a plan, using the letters as a starting point. Mark had mentioned Seattle, a bar, a woman named Sarah. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. I called in a favor from an old friend, Lisa, who worked as a private investigator on the side. She was skeptical but promised to dig into it, to see if she could track him down. Don't get your hopes up, she warned. But I wasn't doing this for hope. I was doing it for Ethan, for the truth. Days turned into weeks, and life settled into a strange new rhythm. Ethan and I were careful with each other, like we were learning to trust again. He started talking more, not just about Mark, but about his life, college, his friends, the dreams he hadn't shared with me in years. I listened, really listened, and I realized how much I'd missed, how much Claire's lies had stolen from us. But we were rebuilding, slowly, piece by piece. Lisa called with updates, small leads that led nowhere, but Ethan didn't give up. He'd sit at the table every night, rereading the letters, searching for clues, his determination a mirror of my own. Then, one evening, Lisa called with news. I found him, she said, her voice clipped, professional. Mark's in Tacoma, running a dive bar called the Rusty Anchor. He's still with that Sarah woman, no kids, no record of anything else. My heart pounded, and I looked at Ethan, who was watching me, his eyes wide with anticipation. What did she say? He asked, and I told him, watching his face shift from hope to something harder, something I couldn't name. We should go, he said, and I nodded, though every instinct screamed to protect him from what we might find. We booked a flight to Tacoma, the letters packed carefully in my bag, a talisman against whatever lay ahead. The plane ride was quiet. Ethan staring out the window, his hands restless in his lap. I wanted to ask what he was feeling, what he hoped to gain from this, but I didn't. Some things he had to face on his own, and all I could do was be there when he did. When we landed, the air was damp, the city gray and unfamiliar, and I felt a strange sense of dislocation, like we were stepping into someone else's life. The rusty anchor was a squat, weathered building on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering in the dusk. Ethan hesitated at the door, his hand on the handle, and I saw the fear in his eyes, the same fear I felt. "You don't have to do this," I said, my voice soft. He shook his head, his jaw tight. "Yes, I do." And then he pushed the door open, and we stepped inside, into the dim light and the smell of stale beer, into the past we'd both been running from. Mark was behind the bar, older than I remembered, his hair graying, his face lined with years I hadn't witnessed. He didn't see us at first, busy pouring a drink for a customer, his movements easy, practiced. Ethan froze, his breath catching, and I put a hand on his shoulder, steadying him, steadying myself. Then Mark looked up, and his eyes met mine, and I saw the recognition hit him, the shock, the guilt. "Laura," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the bar. And then he saw Ethan, and his face changed, a mix of fear and something else, regret, maybe, or shame. Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tremble in his hands. "We need to talk," he said, and Mark nodded, his eyes darting to me, then back to his son. We sat at a corner table, the letters between us, and for the first time in 20 years, I faced the man who'd broken us. But this wasn't about me anymore. It was about Ethan, about the truth, about the family we were trying to rebuild. And as he started to speak, his voice low and raw, I knew this was the moment we'd been waiting for, the moment that would either save us or break us for good. The rusty anchor was a haze of dim lights and low murmurs, the kind of place where people came to forget. Mark sat across from us, his hands wrapped around a glass of water he hadn't touched, his eyes flickering between Ethan and me. He looked smaller than I remembered, not the towering figure who'd walked out on us, but a man worn down by time, by choices he couldn't undo. Ethan sat rigid, his hands clenched on the table, the folder of letters between us like a loaded gun. I wanted to speak, to demand answers, but this was Ethan's moment, not mine. I stayed silent, my heart pounding, as my son faced the father he'd never really known. "Why?" Ethan's voice was low, steady, but I could hear the tremor beneath it, the years of questions packed into that single word. Mark's shoulders slumped, and he looked down at his hands, as if the answer was written there. "I wasn't ready," he said finally, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken the truth in years. "I was young, Ethan. Too young to handle being a father, a husband. Laura." He glanced at me, his eyes heavy with something I didn't want to name. "She was stronger than me. Always was. I knew she'd take care of you." I bit back the urge to scream, to tell him that strength wasn't a choice, it was survival. It was nights spent crying after Ethan was asleep. It was scraping together rent while he was pouring drinks in this godforsaken bar. But Ethan didn't give me the chance. "You didn't even try," he said, his voice rising, drawing glances from the other patrons. "You wrote to Grandma Claire, told her you were starting over, that you didn't want us. You didn't ask about me, not once." He pushed the folder toward Mark, the letters spilling out, their faded ink accusing him. "I read them. All of them." Mark's face paled, and he reached for the letters, then stopped, his hand hovering like he was afraid to touch them. "I didn't know she kept those," he said, his voice barely audible. I thought it was better if you didn't know me. I wasn't good for you, Ethan. I wasn't good for anyone." His words hung in the air, pathetic and hollow, and I saw the moment Ethan's hope shattered, the moment he realized his father wasn't a hero or a villain, just a man who'd failed him. "You don't get to decide that," Ethan said, his voice breaking now, raw with pain. "You don't get to decide what's better for me. You left. You chose to leave." Mark's eyes filled with tears, but I felt no sympathy, only a cold, burning anger. I'd spent years protecting Ethan from this truth, from the man who'd walked away without a fight, and now here we were, picking up the pieces of his cowardice. "I'm sorry," Mark said, his voice cracking. "I know it doesn't mean anything now, but I'm sorry." Ethan shook his head, his hands trembling as he gathered the letters. "Sorry doesn't fix it," he said. "It doesn't give me back the years I spent wondering why I wasn't enough." He stood, his chair scraping against the floor, and I stood with him, my hand on his arm, anchoring him. Mark looked up at us, his face a mask of regret, but he didn't try to stop us. If you ever want to talk, he started, but Ethan cut him off. I don't, he said, his voice final, and we walked out, leaving Mark behind, just as he'd left us. The night air was cold, sharp against my skin, and Ethan stopped just outside the bar, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. I pulled him into a hug, fierce and unyielding, and he let me, his body shaking as he buried his face in my shoulder. I thought it would feel different, he whispered. I thought I'd understand. I held him tighter, my own tears falling now, because I knew there was no understanding this kind of betrayal, no making sense of a father who'd chosen himself over his son. We drove back to the hotel in silence, the city lights blurring past us, and I could feel the weight of what we'd done settling into both of us. Ethan had faced his father, had seen the truth, and it hadn't fixed him, it had broken him open, exposed the raw edges of his pain. But it had also freed him, in a way, from the fantasy Claire had fed him, from the ghost of a father who'd never existed. When we got to the hotel, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. What now? He asked, and I sat beside him, my hand on his back. Now we go home, I said, and we keep going. Together. He nodded, his eyes meeting mine, and I saw something new there, not just pain, but strength, the kind that comes from facing the worst and surviving. We flew back the next day, the letters still in my bag, a reminder of what we'd overcome. But when we got home, something shifted. Ethan didn't retreat to his room or shut me out. He helped me make dinner, talked about his classes, even laughed a little when I burned the garlic bread. It was small, fragile, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, we settled into a new normal. Ethan stopped mentioning Claire, and I didn't ask about her, though I knew she'd called him once, her voice tearful on the voicemail he didn't return. I didn't push him to forgive her, didn't tell him how to feel. That was his journey, not mine. But I noticed the way he looked at me now, the way he'd linger at the table after dinner, asking about my day, about the stories I hadn't told him. He was trying, and so was I, and that was enough. But the past wasn't done with us yet. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, the doorbell rang. Ethan opened it, and there was Claire, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed, a small box in her hands. I need to talk to you, she said, her voice trembling, and I felt my stomach twist, the old anger flaring. Ethan looked at me, his expression unreadable, and I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She set the box on the table, her hands shaking, and I saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear I'd seen when we confronted her with the letters. I was wrong, she said, her voice breaking. I thought I was protecting you, Ethan, but I was protecting myself. These are for you. She opened the box, revealing more letters, photos, even a small toy car I recognized from Ethan's childhood. I kept everything, she said. Everything Mark sent me, everything I didn't show you. I thought I could control the story, but I was wrong. Ethan stared at the box, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, and I knew this was another turning point, another chance to break or heal. And as he reached for the first letter, I braced myself for what came next, knowing that whatever it was, we'd face it together. Claire stood in our cramped living room, her hands clasped tightly around the edges of the box, as if letting go would unravel her completely. Ethan stared at the contents, letters, photos, that tiny toy car he used to carry everywhere when he was 5. The air was thick with unspoken words, with years of lies and half-truths piling up between us. I wanted to tell her to leave, to take her box of guilt and go, but Ethan's eyes were fixed on the items, his expression a mix of curiosity and pain, and I knew this moment wasn't about me. It was about him, about the closure he needed, whether I liked it or not. What is this? Ethan asked, his voice low, almost accusing, as he picked up a photo, a faded snapshot of him as a toddler, sitting on Mark's lap, both of them laughing. Claire's lips trembled, and she took a shaky breath. It's everything I didn't show you, she said. Letters Mark wrote after he left, photos he sent, things I thought would hurt you too much. Ethan's jaw tightened, and he set the photo down, his fingers lingering on its edges. Hurt me, he said, his voice rising. You think hiding this didn't hurt? You think lying about Mom, making me believe she kept him away, wasn't worse? I stood frozen, my heart pounding, watching my son confront the woman who'd shaped so much of his pain. Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. I was wrong, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was giving you a father, someone to look up to. I couldn't bear for you to know the truth, that Mark wasn't strong enough, that he chose to leave. Her words echoed what we'd heard in Tacoma, but hearing them from her, here in our home, felt different. It felt like a confession, raw and unguarded, and I saw the toll it had taken on her, the weight of carrying her son's failures. Ethan picked up another letter, his hands shaking as he unfolded it. "Dear Mom," he read aloud, his voice steady but laced with pain. "I know I messed up. I see Ethan in my dreams sometimes, and it kills me. But I can't go back. Laura's better off without me, and so is he." He stopped, his breath catching, and I felt my own chest tighten, the familiar ache of Mark's abandonment flaring anew. Ethan looked at Claire, his eyes burning. "You read this," he said. "You knew he didn't want me, and you still let me believe he did." "What?" Claire sank onto the couch, her hands covering her face for a moment before she looked up, her eyes wet but resolute. "Because I loved him," she said. "And I loved you. I thought if I could keep Mark alive for you, keep him as someone you could be proud of, it would make up for what he did. I was wrong, Ethan. I see that now." Her voice broke, and she reached for him, but he stepped back, his face a storm of emotions. "You don't get to decide what I need," he said. "You don't get to rewrite my life to make yourself feel better." I wanted to intervene, to pull Ethan away from the pain, but I stayed silent, my hands clenched at my sides. This was his fight, his truth to claim. He reached into the box again, pulling out the toy car, its red paint chipped from years of play. "I remember this," he said, his voice softer now, almost wistful. "I used to pretend Dad was driving it, coming back to get me." My heart broke at that, at the image of my little boy clinging to a fantasy I couldn't give him. Claire's face crumpled, and she whispered, "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I never meant to hurt you." But sorry wasn't enough, not for Ethan, not for me. He set the car down, his hands steady now, and looked at her. "I need time," he said. "I don't know if I can forgive you, not yet." Claire nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, and I saw the weight of his words settle into her, the realization that she might have lost him for good. She stood, picking up the box, but Ethan stopped her. "Leave it," he said, his voice firm. "It's mine now." She hesitated, then set it back down, her hands trembling, and walked to the door. "I'll be here," she said, her voice barely audible. "When you're ready." And then she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her. The apartment felt too quiet after she left, the box sitting on the table like a Pandora's box we weren't sure we wanted to open further. Ethan sank into a chair, his eyes fixed on the toy car, and I sat beside him, my hand resting on his shoulder. "You okay?" I asked, though I knew the answer. He shook his head, a small, bitter laugh escaping. "I don't know what I am," he said. "I thought finding Dad would fix something, but it just made it worse. And now this." He gestured to the box, to the remnants of a past we'd never fully known. "We don't have to go through it now," I said, my voice soft. "It'll be here when you're ready." He nodded, but his hand reached for another letter, as if he couldn't help himself. We spent the night reading, not all of it, but enough to see the pattern Mark's excuses, his regrets, his refusal to face what he'd done. Each letter was a piece of the puzzle, but it didn't complete the picture. It just made it clearer that Mark had been a coward, and Claire had been complicit, shielding him at our expense. By morning, Ethan was exhausted, his eyes red, but there was a clarity in his expression, a strength I hadn't seen before. "I don't want to hate them," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "Dad, Grandma, I don't want to carry that. But I don't know how to let it go." I took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to figure it out alone," I said. "We'll do it together." He looked at me, his eyes searching, and for the first time in years, I felt like he saw Minute as the mother who'd failed him, but as the one who'd fought for him, who'd never stopped. The days that followed were quieter, but not empty. Ethan started opening up more, not just about Mark and Claire, but about himself, his fears, his dreams, the life he wanted to build. I listened, and I shared too, telling him stories I'd kept buried, about the early years, the struggles, the love that had kept me going. We were rebuilding, not just our relationship, but our understanding of each other, and it felt like a gift, hard one, but precious. Claire didn't call again, and Ethan didn't reach out, but I knew that wound was still open, still healing. And as we sat together one evening, the box of letters tucked away but not forgotten, I felt a spark of hope, a belief that we could move forward, not as victims of the past, but as survivors, stronger for it. The box of Claire's secrets sat on the shelf in Ethan's room, untouched for days, but never out of mind. Its presence was a quiet weight, a reminder of the truths we'd uncovered and the ones we still carried. Ethan and I were finding our way back to each other, but it wasn't a straight path. There were moments of laughter, like when he teased me for my terrible pancake flipping skills, and moments of silence, when his eyes would drift to the box, his thoughts somewhere I couldn't follow. I didn't push him. I'd learned that healing wasn't something you could force, not for him, not for me. One morning, as I sipped coffee at the kitchen table, Ethan came in, his hair messy from sleep, his expression serious. "I've been thinking," he said, sitting across from me, "about Grandma Claire." My stomach tightened, but I kept my face neutral, waiting. "I don't know if I can see her again," he continued, his voice low. "Not like before. But I don't want to hate her forever either. It's eating at me." I set my mug down, my hand steady despite the ache in my chest. I wanted to tell him he didn't owe her anything, that she'd made her choices, but I saw the conflict in his eyes, the need to make sense of the woman who'd been both his confidant and his betrayer. "You don't have to decide now," I said, choosing my words carefully. "You can take as long as you need. But whatever you choose, I'm here." He nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly, and I felt a surge of pride for the man he was becoming, one who could face his pain and still search for something better. "I think I want to write to her," he said after a moment. "Not to forgive her, not yet, but to tell her how I feel, to make her understand." I smiled, a small, quiet thing, and squeezed his hand. "That's a start," I said, and he returned the smile, tentative but real. That afternoon, Ethan sat at the table with a notebook, pen in hand, his brow furrowed as he wrote. I stayed in the kitchen, giving him space, but I could see the intensity in his posture, the way he poured himself onto the page. When he finished, he handed me the letter, his eyes uncertain. "Will you read it?" he asked. I nodded, my throat tight, and took the paper, his handwriting neat but heavy, like every word carried a piece of his heart. "Dear Grandma Claire," it began. "I've spent weeks trying to understand why you did what you did. I trusted you, and you used that to make me doubt my mom, the one person who's always been there. Your lies hurt me, hurt us, and I don't know if I can ever see you the same way. But I don't want to carry this anger forever. I want to let it go, not for you, but for me. I need time, and I need you to respect that. Maybe one day we can talk, but it has to be on my terms." It was raw, honest, and I felt tears prick my eyes as I handed it back to him. "It's perfect," I said, and he nodded, folding the letter carefully, like it was something precious. He mailed it the next day, and I could see the weight lift from him, not completely, but enough to make a difference. We didn't talk about it again, but I noticed small changes. Ethan smiled more, lingered longer when we talked, even started planning for the future, talking about transferring to a college closer to home. I felt like we were building something new, something stronger, not just between us, but within ourselves. I was learning to let go of my own anger, the resentment I'd carried for Mark, for Claire, for the years I'd felt like I wasn't enough. But the past wasn't done with us. A week later, a letter arrived, addressed to Ethan in Claire's elegant handwriting. He stared at it for a long time before opening it, his hand steady but his eyes wary. I sat beside him, silent, as he read aloud. "Dear Ethan," she wrote, "your letter broke my heart, not because of your anger, but because you're right. I failed you. I thought I was protecting you, but I was protecting myself, my memories of Mark. I have no excuse, only regret. I'll respect your boundaries, and I'll wait, as long as it takes, for you to decide what comes next. I love you always." Ethan set the letter down, his face unreadable, and I waited, letting him process. "She sounds different," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Like she gets it." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I trusted Claire's words. She'd always been good at saying the right thing, but this time, there was a rawness to her letter, a vulnerability I hadn't expected. "What do you want to do?" I asked, and he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe nothing, for now. But I'm glad," she wrote back. I reached for his hand, and he let me hold it, his fingers warm against mine, and I felt a spark of hope, fragile but real. The weeks that followed were a quiet kind of healing. Ethan started therapy, something he'd resisted before, and I could see it helping, giving him tools to navigate the pain. I started too, talking through the years of guilt and anger, the weight of being the only parent Ethan had. We were both learning to forgive not just Claire, not just Mark, but ourselves. And in those moments when we'd sit together, watching old movies or arguing over pizza toppings, I felt the pieces of our family coming back together, not perfect, but whole. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, Ethan looked at me, his eyes clear, his smile soft. I'm glad it's you, Mom, he said. I'm glad you're the one who raised me. My heart swelled, and I pulled him into a hug, tears streaming down my face. I'm glad too, I whispered, and for the first time in years, I believed it. The scars were still there, the box of letters a reminder of what we'd lost, but we were more than our pain. We were a family, battered but unbroken, and as I held my son, I knew we'd keep fighting, keep healing, keep living no matter what came next. The apartment felt different now, like the air had cleared after a long storm. Ethan and I were finding a rhythm, a balance between the past and the present. The box of Claire's letters and keepsakes stayed on his shelf, but he didn't touch it often, and I didn't ask. It was there, a quiet reminder, but it no longer dominated us. We were moving forward, not without scars, but with a strength we'd earned together. Ethan was back at college, diving into his studies with a focus I hadn't seen in years, and I was picking up extra shifts at the diner, not out of desperation, but because I wanted to save for something better, a new place, maybe, or a trip for just the two of us. But life has a way of pulling you back just when you think you're free. One Saturday morning, as I was folding laundry, the phone rang. Ethan was at the library, so I answered, expecting a telemarketer or a wrong number. Instead, it was Claire, her voice soft, hesitant. "Laura," she said, and I froze, my hands tightening around a towel. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to see you. Both of you. Please." My first instinct was to hang up, to shut her out like she'd shut us out with her lies. But something in her tone stopped my fear, maybe, or something deeper. "Why?" I asked, my voice cold. "It's about Mark," she said, and my stomach dropped. He's sick. He reached out to me last week, and I didn't know what to do. I thought Ethan should know. Sick. The word landed like a stone, stirring up feelings I'd buried in Tacoma. I didn't care about Mark, not after everything, but Ethan might, and that was enough to make me listen. "What's wrong with him?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Claire hesitated, then said, "Cancer. It's advanced. He doesn't have long." I closed my eyes, the towel slipping from my hands. "I'll talk to Ethan," I said finally. "But it's his choice, not yours." She thanked me, her voice breaking, and I hung up, the weight of her words settling into me. When Ethan got home, I told him, watching his face for any sign of what he felt. His expression hardened, his eyes distant, and for a moment, I thought he'd shut down, retreat into the anger that had driven him to Tacoma. But then he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know what to do, Mom," he said, sitting on the couch, his hands clasped between his knees. "Part of me wants to see him, too. I don't know, say goodbye or something. But part of me just wants to forget he exists." I sat beside him, my hand on his back, and I felt the weight of his conflict, the pull between closure and self-preservation. "You don't have to decide today," I said. "But whatever you choose, I'm with you." He nodded, leaning into me, and I held him, my heart aching for the boy who'd spent so long chasing a father who didn't deserve him. We sat like that for a while, the silence comforting, and I knew he'd need time to process, to weigh the pain against the possibility of peace. That night, he wrote in his notebook again, not a letter this time, but thoughts, feelings, the kind of raw honesty he was learning to embrace. I didn't read it, but I saw the way his pen moved, steady and sure, and I knew he was finding his way. A few days later, Ethan made his decision. "I want to see him," he said over breakfast, his voice calm but resolute. "Not for him, but for me. I need to close this chapter." I nodded, proud of his courage, and we made plans to go back to Tacoma. Claire offered to come, to mediate, but Ethan refused, his voice firm. "This is between me and him," he said, and I saw the strength in him, the man he was becoming, not defined by his father's failures, but by his own choices. The drive to Tacoma was different this time, less charged with anger, more with a quiet resolve. The rusty anchor was closed when we arrived, but Mark was waiting at a small house nearby, a modest place with peeling paint and a sagging porch. He looked worse than before, thinner, his skin sallow, his eyes sunken. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, just walked up to him and said, "I'm here to say goodbye." Mark's face crumpled, and he nodded, gesturing to a couple of chairs on the porch. I stayed back, giving them space, but close enough to hear, to be there if Ethan needed me. They talked for an hour, maybe more, their voices low, sometimes heated, sometimes soft. I heard fragments Mark's apologies, Ethan's questions, the pain they both carried. Mark didn't make excuses this time, didn't try to justify what he'd done. He just listened, letting Ethan say what he needed to say, and I saw the weight lift from my son, not completely, but enough to let him breathe. When they were done, Ethan stood, his back straight, and Mark reached for his hand, a gesture Ethan allowed but didn't return. "Take care of yourself," Ethan said, his voice steady, and then he turned to me, his eyes clear, and we left. On the drive back, Ethan was quiet, but there was a peace in him I hadn't seen before. "I'm glad I went," he said finally, his voice soft. "It didn't fix anything, but it made it real. He's not a ghost anymore." I reached for his hand, squeezing it, and I felt the strength of our bond, the trust we'd rebuilt. We didn't talk about Claire, but I knew she was still there, a question mark in our story, and I trusted Ethan to decide what came next. For now, we were enough, and as the road stretched out before us, I felt a quiet certainty that we'd keep moving forward, together, no matter what. The months that followed were a slow, steady climb. Ethan and I settled into a life that felt less like survival and more like living. He was thriving at college, his grades climbing, his smile easier. I started taking night classes, something I'd always wanted to do, and Ethan would tease me about my stacks of textbooks, calling me the oldest freshman ever. We'd laugh, and in those moments, I'd catch glimpses of the future we were building, one where the past didn't define us. The box of Claire's letters stayed on Ethan's shelf, a relic we rarely touched, but its presence no longer felt like a threat. It was just part of our story, a chapter we'd faced and survived. Claire didn't reach out again, and Ethan didn't talk about her much, but I could tell she was still on his mind. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at the box, his expression distant, and I'd wonder what he was feeling: anger, sadness, maybe a longing for the grandmother he'd once adored. I didn't push him to talk about it, trusting he'd come to me when he was ready. And one evening, he did. We were sitting on the couch, a half-eaten pizza between us, when he said, "I think I want to see her." My heart skipped, but I kept my face calm, waiting. "Not to forgive her," he added quickly, "but to understand. I need to know why she did it." I nodded, my throat tight. "Okay," I said. "But we do it together." He smiled, a small, grateful thing. And we made a plan to visit Claire, not at her house, but on neutral ground, a coffee shop downtown, a place where we could talk without the weight of her perfect world pressing down on us. When the day came, Ethan was nervous, his hands fidgeting as we walked to the shop. I felt it too, the uncertainty of facing the woman who'd hurt us so deeply, but I was proud of Ethan for choosing this, for seeking answers instead of running from them. Claire was already there when we arrived, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a mug, her face pale but composed. She stood when she saw us, her eyes flickering with hope and fear. "Ethan, Laura," she said, her voice soft, and I nodded, keeping my distance as we sat. Ethan took the lead, his voice steady but firm. "I need to know why," he said. "Why you lied, why you kept those letters, why you made me think Mom was the problem." Claire's hands tightened around her mug, and she took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his. "I was afraid," she said, her voice trembling but honest. "Afraid of losing you, of losing the only connection I had to Mark. When he left, I told myself it was Laura's fault, that she'd driven him away. It was easier than admitting he'd failed me too." She looked at me, her eyes wet. "I was wrong, Laura. I saw you raising Ethan, doing everything I couldn't, and I resented you for it. I used the letters to keep Mark alive for Ethan, to make him someone he could love, but I hurt you both instead." Her voice broke, and she looked down, her shoulders shaking. Ethan listened, his face unreadable, and I could feel the weight of his thoughts, the struggle to reconcile the grandmother he'd loved with the woman who'd betrayed him. "I trusted you," he said finally, his voice low. "You were my family, and you broke that." Claire flinched, but she nodded, accepting his words. "I know," she said, "and I'll spend the rest of my life regretting it. But I love you, Ethan, and I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust again, if you'll let me." I watched Ethan, waiting for his response, my heart aching for him. He didn't speak for a long moment, his eyes searching her face, and then he said, "I don't know if I can. Not yet. But I'm here, and that's a start." Claire's face lit up, a fragile hope breaking through, and I felt a strange mix of relief and wariness. I didn't trust her, not fully, but I trusted Ethan, trusted his strength, his heart. We left the coffee shop soon after, the air between us lighter, not healed, but open, like a wound that was finally starting to close. Back home, Ethan was quiet, but there was a peace in him, a sense that he'd taken a step toward letting go. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive her," he said as we sat at the kitchen table, the familiar comfort of our space wrapping around us. But I don't want to carry this anymore. I want to move on. I reached for his hand, my eyes stinging. You will, I said. We will. And I believed it. Not because the pain was gone, but because we'd faced it together, because we were stronger than the lies, the betrayals, the ghosts of our past. Months later, we got word that Mark had passed. Ethan took it quietly, his grief not for the father he'd lost, but for the one he'd never had. We didn't go to the funeral, but Ethan wrote a letter, not to send, but to burn, a final release of the pain he'd carried. I watched him light the match, the flames curling around the paper, and I felt my own release, a letting go of the anger I'd held for so long. Claire sent a card, simple and brief, offering condolences, and Ethan kept it, tucking it into the box with the others, a small gesture toward a future where forgiveness might be possible. As spring turned to summer, Ethan and I planned a trip, just the two of us, to the coast, a place we'd always talked about but never gone. We stood on the beach, the waves crashing at our feet, and he looked at me, his smile wide and unguarded. I love you, Mom, he said, and I pulled him into a hug, my heart full. I love you too, I whispered, and as we stood there, the ocean stretching out before us, I knew we'd made it through. Not perfect, not without scars, but together, and that was enough. Our family, battered but whole, was ours to keep, and no one, not Mark, not Claire, not the past could take that from us.